part 5. Sorry. The treatise that he writes he calls the Leviathan. Now, Hobbes has been criticized and damned even in his own time as an atheist. He was not an atheist. He's even been labeled as a Christian atheist. He was not technically a Christian atheist. What he argues is as following. This is a major work that I'm reducing to a few points. He says, what is the source of sovereignty? The sovereignty means the right to determine what you do. He says, let's start with the state of nature. Now, for him, the state of nature is not Adam and Eve in paradise, which is the basis of all kinds of Christian political theology. So no, we're not going to do it that way. State of nature. He's not ever saying that this was an actual state. But in a state of nature, every individual has their own sovereignty. They're perfectly free individuals. And while the libertarians may think that is great, what would it be like? That's where he comes up with his famous statement and phrase, in such a state of nature, where everybody has their individual sovereignty. They can do what they deem best fit for themselves. Life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. Why is that? Because it's a dog-eat-dog world. There are no rules. There are no laws. Everyone is a law unto themselves. And if you have something that I want, if I can take it from you, I damn well am going to. So the survival of the fittest, and there are not very many fittest. And that is not a way to really live. That's why life is short, it's brutish, because it's just, instead of dog-eat-dog world, we're constant warfare with everyone, because it's each individual out for themselves. It's short because we're going to die, and it's very, very nasty. So he's theorizes that in that state of nature, people realize that's the case. The only guard against it is the collective. So he says that human beings, to provide for the common good of all, give up their individual sovereignty to the state. And once they give up their individual sovereignty to the state, they can't not gain it back. The state has all the sovereignty. That is what he calls is a social contract. That the individuals with individual sovereignty make a contract with the state to be the sovereign. They give up their sovereignty to the state, whereby the state becomes an absolute ruler. Now, within that absolute state, you have to follow, if you're a common person, or even if you're not a common person, if you're noble, you have to follow the dictates of the absolute state, because it's only the state that has sovereignty. You don't. You've given that up in the social contract for the good of all. And yet, you still have freedom of conscience. So you can believe whatever you want to believe, or nothing at all. You can believe nothing at all. Or you can believe whatever kind of weird thing you might believe. Hobbes definitely had ideas in terms of what was quote unquote right belief, but you have to conform to the dictates of the state church. So if you want to believe in Presbyterianism, fine. If you want to believe in Roman Catholicism, fine. But you have to adhere to the state church, which is Anglicanism. The Leviathan is a biblical image, this biblical image from the Old Testament, this great monster all over the place. And that was his concept of the state. The absolute state is this monstrous thing that controls everything because it has all sovereignty into itself. Now, it's supposed to govern for the good of all. That was the whole basis of the social contract. Hobbes did not really pose this question. It wasn't until Locke that said, okay, what if that Leviathan is not ruling for the good of all? Then what? And we'll talk about Locke when we get there, because his idea, also based on the social contract, is altered and different from Hobbes's. But that this concept of a social contract begins with Thomas Hobbes. And with Thomas Hobbes in the context of the Civil War. He's not even thinking about, what is about the abuse of power. He's saying, okay, even if there are abuses, almost like Augustinus of Ancona, I think I mentioned, in terms of papal supremacy. Are there bad popes? Yes, they're bad popes, but you have to follow them as long as they don't command you to do something heretical, like worship Satan. Then you don't follow them, then they're no longer pope. In some ways, that is that same basic argument that the government as sovereign is absolute and you have to follow its dictates, and doesn't ask what happens when they abuse it. That was Locke, because Hobbes is writing the context of the Civil War where things are going to hell. Civil War is not a nice state to be in. And that was his solution. And that provided the basis for English absolutism. That's why I said bottom up, is because he starts theorizing not from God, creation, Adam and Eve, to divine right of kings. He starts by saying, let's throw all that out. Let's look at the state of nature, theoretically, in individual sovereignty. And what are the logical outcomes of individual sovereignty, where every individual can do whatever they want, where every individual is a law unto themselves? Because where does law come from? It comes from the government, or it comes from God. Individual sovereignty, individual law, individual ability to determine what is right and wrong for oneself, independently of any superstructure, leads to degradation, leads to life being poor, nasty, brutish, and short, in a sense, a constant state of war, which is what he saw happening in England. Solution: absolute state, which rules by divine right, because it is intended to rule for the good of all and be for the good of all. Now, Hobbes said, even if you don't agree, you can believe whatever you want. So if you disagree with the religion of the state religion, the state church, you still have to follow it. Here, too, he doesn't pose the question of what do you do if doing so threatens your eternal salvation. He would basically say, your salvation is based upon your conscience. This is simply a matter of politics. So here we see, too, politics being completely separated from theology. This was an important step, theoretically, in terms of political theory, that was the precursor to John Locke and the Glorious Revolution, which we'll get to later on. And I think that about covers it in terms of English absolutism, in terms of this almost emerging individualism, not just in terms of the levelers and so, but in terms of Hobbes, freedom of conscience. Within an absolute state, you can believe whatever you want, even though there's tensions there. And those tensions are what would be breaking out all over the place. We are seeing this in the context of the development of the nation state as the new myth, whereby the Leviathan for Hobbes is the overarching myth that provides the structure for making sense of reality, and that we have to adhere to that. The concept of Christendom completely gone by the wayside now. This is really the early modern world that is so radically different from the medieval world and medieval concepts and structures. Now, next lecture, we'll see a slightly different form of absolutism, French absolutism, which actually is more medieval in that sense. But I wanted to present the English Hobbesian view as the more radical version. And Hobbes was condemned at the time. He was controversial. And it's like, what do we do about this? Because, again, almost similarly in some ways to Machiavelli, he is basically saying that politics has nothing to do with theology and religion, even though religion is important for politics. It needs to be there, definitely. Why? For the good of the state. And what is the good of the state? The good of the state is good, the good of the people. That's the context. Thank you for your patience. My apologies for having 5 parts. I swore I wasn't going to do that. I hope I'll never do that again. But thank you. I'll be back next week. We'll talk, or not next week, but for next lecture, and we'll be talking about French absolutism and the ongoing development of the early modern world. Thank you so much. Bye bye.